When Lord Henry Blackwood stole the mine's safety money, he knew exactly how to erase the evidence. He handed the shattered cinder pit foundry to Catherine Vance, the widow of the foreman who had died because of his corrupt iron, and forced her to cast a 5-ton steam cylinder from brittle scrap metal in just 14 days. If it failed, hundreds of trapped miners would drown, and she would carry the blame while he walked away untouched. Everyone else saw a mountain of useless iron. Catherine saw something different. Hidden among the broken castings were thousands of worn horseshoes and rusted rivets, wrought iron that could become the strongest gray iron the region had ever seen if she survived long enough to remake it. Before the flood reached the miners, she would have to gamble everything on a river of molten metal that no crane could ever lift. The first thing Lord Henry Blackwood kicked aside was the helmet. It struck the base of the cold furnace and rolled through a bed of black clinker, leaving a dark smear where the blood had not yet dried. No one in the yard moved to retrieve it. The injured miners stood beneath the broken crane with their caps in their hands. 5 men wrapped in bandages and coal dust, each of them watching the Duke, as if one careless breath might give him cause to finish what the flooding had begun. Catherine Vance watched the helmet settle against a cracked firebrick. Her husband's initials had been punched into the rim with a blunt nail 12 years earlier. T.V. The left side was crushed inward, where the failed pump cylinder had burst. A narrow strip of leather still hung from the chin strap. She did not look away from it until Blackwood's solicitor cleared his throat. "The terms are plain," the man said. He held the document open above a portable writing desk. Wind pushed at the corners. Behind him, Cinder Pit Foundry stood with its roofline sagging toward the mountain, its chimney split by an old lightning scar, its timber hoist dark with rot. Rainwater had gathered in shallow pools across the casting floor. The place smelled of wet ash, sulfur, and iron, left too long in the weather. Blackwood took the contract from the solicitor and tossed it onto the dead slag beside the helmet. "Plain enough for a woman, I should think." His voice was mild. That made the words worse. He was 55, broad through the chest, clean-shaven, and dressed for the cold in a black wool coat that had never been near furnace smoke. His gloves were pale gray. Not a mark touched them. He looked past Catherine toward the ruined buildings with the distant irritation of a landowner inspecting a wall he had already decided not to repair. "The miners below Bringlas have 14 days of breathable passage," he said. "Less, should the lower gallery take water faster than expected." One of the injured men shifted his weight. His splinted ankle scraped the stone. Blackwood did not turn. "The main pumping engine requires a new pressure cylinder. 5 tons finished weight. The pattern is inside. The iron has been delivered. The foundry is now yours." Catherine looked toward the scrap heap beyond the furnace wall. Broken stove plates, fractured wheels, white-edged castings, horseshoes, rivets, twisted straps, and lengths of corroded bar had been thrown together without sorting. Even at that distance, she could see the pale, crystalline faces where several pieces had snapped. White iron, too much sulfur, too little patience in the smelting, metal made cheap and sold dear, the same metal that had killed Thomas. The solicitor bent to recover the contract before the damp reached it. He placed it on the desk and turned the final page toward her. "If the cylinder is not completed and accepted within 14 days, all liabilities arising from the failure of the mine pumping system will transfer to the operator of Cinder Pit Foundry." "To me?" Catherine said. Her first words carried farther across the yard than the solicitor's explanation. He hesitated. "Yes." "And the debts owed to the families?" "Also to you." "The deaths?" Blackwood answered this time. "Men die in mines, Mrs. Vance." One of the bandaged workers made a low sound in his throat. Catherine raised 2 fingers without looking at him. He stopped. Blackwood's attention settled on her hand. "If the Crown determines negligence," the solicitor continued, "your property may be seized. Custodial rights may be reviewed. Penal transportation is also provided for under the indemnity clause." Catherine read the page. She did not hurry. The ink had pooled at the ends of certain strokes, suggesting the contract had been copied the previous night. The transfer date had already been entered. So had the valuation of the scrap, at nearly 4 times its worth. The furnace, though visibly cracked, was listed as operational. The lifting gear was listed as sound. Blackwood had not merely prepared for her failure. He had priced it. "Where is the coke allotment?" she asked. "The Duke retains control of all high-grade coke produced at Bryn Glass," the solicitor said. "And the blowing engine?" "Operated under a state authority." Catherine lifted her eyes to Blackwood. "You have given me a furnace without fuel and a melt without air. I have given you an opportunity." He stepped closer, careful to avoid the mud. The 5 miners lowered their eyes, not from respect, but because men who depended on a mine learned early that witnesses could be punished. Blackwood looked toward the bloodied helmet. "Women are very good at grief," he said. "Let us see whether yours can melt iron." For the first time, Catherine's breathing changed. Only once, a measured draw through the nose, held for the space of a hammer fall, then released. She took the pen. The solicitor offered her the desk, but she placed the contract on the flat iron cheek of a broken mold box. The wood beneath it was damp. She wiped the surface with her sleeve, signed Catherine Vance, in a hand made firm by 12 years of recording furnace charges, and turned the page back. The solicitor stared at the signature. Blackwood smiled. It was not triumph, it was relief. That told her more than the contract had. He needed her to accept the Foundry. He needed an operator whose name could stand between his accounts and the dead. He needed the cylinder to fail under her authority, not his. Catherine handed back the pen. "When does the 14-day term begin?" "Midnight last night," said the solicitor. 14 days had already become 13 days, and 11 hours. Blackwood turned toward his carriage. "You will find the pattern inside. I advise you not to waste time." The horses pulled away before anyone retrieved Thomas's helmet. Catherine waited until the wheels had passed beyond the slag road. Then she crossed the yard, crouched beside the furnace, and lifted the helmet with both hands. The metal was cold. A clot of blackened blood had dried beneath the rim. She gave it to Owen Price, the oldest of the injured miners. "Clean this," she said. "Do not repair the dent." Owen looked at her. "Why?" "Because it is evidence." She walked to the scrap heap. The men followed more slowly. They had expected grief, perhaps rage, perhaps an order to begin rebuilding the furnace before daylight failed. Instead, Catherine picked up a broken wheel, spoke, examined its grain, and dropped it. She tested a stoveplate, then a shattered gear tooth. Each fracture showed the same bright, brittle structure. Bad iron, deliberately bad. Then she saw the horseshoes. Hundreds of them lay beneath the cast scrap, rusted almost black, worn thin at the toes, mixed with long rivets and wagon straps. She freed one with the steel bar and struck it against the edge of a stone block. It bent. It did not break. The men watched her turn it in the weak autumn light. "What is it?" Owen asked. Catherine looked toward the cracked furnace, then toward the mountain beyond it, where pale limestone showed through the wet grass. "The reason he should not have left us the scrap." By dawn, 13 days remained. Mist drifted across the yard in slow ribbons, softening the broken outlines of Cinder Pit Foundry without hiding any of its failures. The cracked chimney leaned slightly east. Rainwater still stood across the casting floor, reflecting shattered roof beams that should have been replaced years before. Somewhere inside the main shop, water struck iron with the slow, patient rhythm of a leaking roof that no one had bothered to mend. Catherine unlocked the foundry doors before the church bell rang. The swollen timbers resisted until Owen Price leaned his shoulder against them. Hinges screamed. Cold air escaped from the darkness, carrying the smell of damp clay, furnace ash, burned sand, and rust. It was not the smell of a dead foundry. It was the smell of one that had been abandoned halfway through its work. The 5 miners entered without speaking. Each man looked where habit directed him. One inspected the roof, another glanced toward the crane. A third instinctively searched for the water barrel that had once stood beside the pouring floor. Catherine ignored all of it. She walked directly to the furnace. The reverberatory roof had opened along a crack nearly 6 feet long. Someone had attempted a repair years earlier, using ordinary brick instead of fire brick. The patch had failed after only a handful of heats. White ash clung to the broken joints. She ran her fingers along the fracture. The surface crumbled beneath her thumb. "They saved money here," she said quietly. Owen nodded. "They saved money everywhere." She did not answer. Instead, she crouched beside the firebox and lifted the iron inspection plate. Old clinker blocked nearly half the draft passage. The grate bars beneath had sagged from repeated overheating. Not neglected, overworked. Someone had forced the furnace beyond its proper temperature for months. She stood. "We repair nothing until we know what deserves repairing." The miners exchanged uncertain looks. "Shouldn't we begin rebuilding the roof?" asked Evan Morgan, whose left arm remained wrapped from shoulder to wrist. "If we rebuild the wrong furnace," Catherine replied, "we lose 2 days." She picked up a length of chalk from the molding bench. Across one wall she drew 4 columns. Furnace, crane, mold shop, scrap. "We inspect." The morning disappeared into work. Owen measured the crane timbers with a carpenter's rule salvaged from a cabinet whose drawers had swollen shut. Evan cleared debris from the molding room. 2 others tested the traveling rails suspended beneath the roof. Catherine walked the scrapyard alone. She sorted every piece by sound before she judged it by appearance. Cast wheels rang with a short, brittle note. Broken stove plates answered with dull fractures. Axle straps bent instead of snapping. Rust meant little. The metal beneath mattered more. She struck each piece once with a hammer, listening. Sharp, dead, clear, dull. Again, again, again. Near noon, she uncovered the horseshoes she had noticed the previous afternoon. There were more than she had expected. Not dozens, hundreds. Mixed among them lay thousands of rivets, wagon straps, chain links, broken hinges, and lengths of old boiler tie rod. Every one had once been forged beneath a hammer instead of poured into a mold. Wrought iron. Expensive once. Worth almost nothing as scrap. She smiled for the first time since Thomas had died. Evan noticed. "What did you find?" "Not what." She held up one of the rusted shoes. "Who?" The miners frowned. "The blacksmiths." She tossed another shoe onto a growing pile. Every mine in this valley replaced horseshoes every season. Every broken cart gave up rivets. Every old boiler surrendered straps. They threw them all here because wrought iron won't flow inside a mold. Owen picked one up. "It still won't." "No." She looked toward the furnace. "But perhaps it doesn't have to remain what it is." The men waited. She did not explain further. Not yet. By afternoon she entered the molding shop. Rows of loam molds rested beneath torn canvas covers. Most had collapsed. Others had cracked from years of drying and freezing. She broke one apart with her boot. The clay inside had separated into thin layers. Too dry, too weak. A large cylinder mold cast in that condition would fail before the metal reached halfway. She made another mark on the wall. "Rebuild core oven." Evan read it aloud. "We don't even have enough coal. We'll need less coal than another funeral." Silence settled over the room. No one argued. Late in the day, Owen called from the crane. "The main beam is rotten." She climbed the ladder herself. The oak looked sound until her steel bar pierced nearly 3 inches into its center. Moisture had eaten it from within. The crane could never lift 5 tons. Not safely. She climbed back down without disappointment. One more certainty was always better than one more hope. Outside, she walked beyond the yard toward the hillside where pale bands of stone cut through the wet earth. She knelt beside the exposed rock. Limestone. Hard. Dense. Clean enough to burn. She chipped away a fragment with her bar and rubbed the fresh surface between her fingers. White powder coated her glove. Behind her, Owen approached. "I thought you were looking for iron." "I was. And now? I'm looking for everything the iron is missing." He stared at the stone. "I don't understand." "You don't have to." She slipped the limestone into her apron pocket. "I only need you to trust that we have not been left with worthless metal." Owen looked back toward the foundry. The cracked chimney stood against the fading autumn sky, like the spine of a wounded animal refusing to fall. For the first time since Blackwood had ridden away, he believed it might survive. As the last light disappeared behind the Welsh hills, Catherine climbed the pattern loft above the casting floor. Dust covered every shelf. At the far end, rested the enormous wooden pattern for the rescue cylinder. She brushed away years of soot. The dimensions were larger than she had feared. Nearly 5 tons finished. No crane inside Cinder Pit could ever lift it. She rested one hand against the timber. Then she looked down through the broken roof toward the furnace below. The crane was impossible. The cylinder was necessary. Somewhere between those two facts, she knew, lay the only path that could save the miners. 11 days remained. The first fire Catherine lit inside Cinder Pit was never meant to melt iron. It was built to expose weakness. She stacked split oak beneath the damaged furnace arch, feeding only enough flame to warm the old masonry by slow degrees. Steam rose from cracks hidden inside the brickwork. Tiny beads of moisture hissed and disappeared before the fire had reached proper heat. Owen watched from the charging floor. If we'd filled her yesterday, the roof would have fallen into the melt, Catherine answered. She crouched beside the firebox, studying the color creeping across the inner brick. Dull red, cherry, brighter along the repaired section than the original lining. Different expansion, different brick. Whoever had patched the furnace had cared only that it survived another week, not another year. She picked up a lump hammer. Mark every brick that sounds hollow. The miners spread through the furnace room. Iron struck firebrick in careful rhythm. Most answered with a short, solid note. Others returned a dead sound. Catherine marked each one with white chalk. By noon, nearly a quarter of the arch carried white crosses. Evan stared upward. Can we replace that many? We replace only the ones holding the rest. He frowned. How do you know which those are? She smiled faintly. Because arches carry weight the same way people do. She climbed the scaffold herself. One brick after another came free beneath her hands. Some had fractured clean through. Others had been held in place only by ash packed into the joints. When the final damaged section dropped safely onto the sand below, daylight appeared through a gap almost large enough for a child to crawl through. No one spoke. The furnace looked worse than before. Catherine seemed relieved. Better an honest hole than a hidden one. The words lingered in the silence. Work resumed. Fresh firebrick could not be bought. There was neither money nor time. Instead, Catherine ordered the sound bricks cleaned and relaid, while broken pieces were cut into wedges that locked the surviving arch tighter than before. Every joint received fresh refractory clay, mixed with crushed fired brick from the collapsed lining itself. Waste became repair. By late afternoon, the opening had vanished. The scar remained visible. She left it there. No one would mistake this furnace for a new one. It only needed to survive long enough to save lives. Outside, the scrapyard grew into ordered rows. Cast iron, wrought iron, unknown alloy, reject. Every piece passed beneath Catherine's hammer. When a rusted wagon strap bent without cracking, she nodded. When a broken stove plate snapped like dry bread, she pushed it toward another pile. Evan finally asked the question everyone had been holding. Why keep separating them if they all end up inside one furnace? They won't. He waited. Wrought iron was made under a hammer, she said. Cast iron was born inside a mold. They remember different lives. The miners exchanged puzzled looks. She picked up 2 pieces. One shattered beneath a single blow. The other bent nearly in half. The Duke seized scrap. She tossed both onto different piles. I see ingredients. Toward evening, Owen found the old pyrometer shelf beside the furnace wall. It held nothing except dust and an empty brass frame. I thought Navy foundries used measuring instruments. They did. And here, we have our eyes. He looked uncertain. You can truly judge temperature from the flame? I never judge the flame. She opened the furnace door slightly. Fresh air rushed inward. The fire changed almost instantly. Yellow became bright orange. Orange faded toward white along the hottest edge. She watched only a heartbeat before closing the door again. My first master taught me something before he ever allowed me near molten metal. She brushed soot from the iron latch. Iron lies, fire lies less. The words carried her backward for only a moment. Not to childhood, to Portsmouth, to a foundry where naval cannon rested in endless rows beneath black roofs. She remembered standing no taller than the charging shovel, while old Master Ellison pointed toward the furnace mouth. Never trust a number first. Trust what the fire is trying to tell you. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. She returned to the present before another brick cooled. Night settled over Cinder Pit. The repaired furnace accepted its first true firing. Coke was too precious to waste. They fed the fire with charcoal, timber offcuts, and every dry beam that had once belonged to a collapsed storage shed. Flames rolled across the low roof of the reverberatory chamber, instead of striking the metal directly. Exactly as they should. Catherine watched the pattern. Not the brightness. The movement. Smooth. Even. No cold corners. The draft held. The repaired arch did not shift. Owen smiled despite himself. It lives. It breathes. There is a difference? There always is. She handed him a ledger rescued from a damp office cupboard. Write down everything. The fuel, the time, the repairs, the weather, the color. He looked surprised. The color? If something fails tomorrow, I want to know whether today warned us. Just before midnight, Evan hurried across the casting floor, carrying a wooden board wrapped in old canvas. I found this upstairs. He laid it on the bench. Catherine folded back the cloth. Inside rested the original pattern maker's drawings for the rescue cylinder. Not complete. Only sections remained. But each carried careful notes in faded ink. Wall thickness, core supports, cooling allowances, shrinkage marks. One corner bore another hand, written years later. Do not pour below full heat. Internal fracture risk. She read the warning twice. The ink had nearly vanished. Whoever had written it understood exactly what kind of casting this would become. Someone had already fought this battle once. She closed the board gently. Outside, the furnace continued its slow, steady roar beneath the autumn sky. Inside the office, Catherine spread the surviving drawings across the table. Then her eyes stopped on one measurement. The finished cylinder weighed almost exactly 5 tons. She looked instinctively toward the rotting crane outside. No repair could make those timbers carry such a load. For the first time since taking the Foundry, she accepted a truth she had resisted. They would never lift the finished casting, which meant they would have to find a way that required lifting nothing at all. 10 days remained. The furnace finally held enough heat to attempt its first trial pour. No one celebrated. Inside Cinder Pit, confidence had become something too expensive to spend before it was earned. The repaired arch glowed a deep orange beneath the sweeping flame. Air moved steadily through the firebox despite the worn draft passages. The charge inside the hearth settled slowly as cast scrap softened into a dull, uneven pool. Catherine stood motionless beside the charging door, one hand resting against the iron tapping bar, while the other shielded her eyes from the brightness. She was not watching the metal. She was watching the flame above it. More charcoal, she said quietly. Owen hesitated. We're already using tomorrow's stack. We're still below pouring heat. Without another word, he fed the furnace. The roar deepened. The men waited in silence while another hour disappeared. At last, Catherine nodded. Bring the test mold. Evan and 2 others carried a small cylindrical mold onto the casting floor. It stood only knee-high, hardly impressive beside the massive wooden pattern waiting in the loft, but every man present understood its importance. If this failed, the full cylinder would never succeed. Catherine knelt beside the mold. She pressed her palm against the outer clay, still warm from the drying fire. Not warm enough. She frowned. How long has this been out of the oven? Perhaps an hour, Evan answered. It felt dry. It isn't the surface I'm worried about. She looked toward the furnace again. The metal would not wait forever. Every minute consumed more fuel than they could replace. She weighed 2 dangers against each other. Lose heat inside the furnace, or risk pouring too soon. Finally, she stood. We pour. No one questioned the decision. The tap hole was opened with careful blows from the steel bar. A thin stream of brilliant metal spilled into the sand runner, before thickening into a smooth, glowing flow. Heat rolled across the casting floor like an invisible wave. The miners stepped back instinctively as the iron found its path toward the waiting mold. For several heartbeats, everything appeared perfect. The runner filled. The gate accepted the flow. Molten iron disappeared cleanly into the mold. Then, a sharp crack echoed through the shop. Catherine's head snapped toward the sound. Steam burst from one side of the mold. Back. Her warning came a fraction too late. The trapped moisture exploded into white vapor. The side of the mold shattered. Liquid iron erupted through the opening in a spray of sparks and blazing droplets, striking the sand floor with violent hissing bursts. Burning fragments scattered beneath nearby benches. A timber support caught fire almost instantly. The men threw themselves clear. Owen seized a shovel and buried the burning metal beneath dry sand before it could spread farther. Evan dragged the flaming timber away with an iron hook, while another miner overturned a barrel of loose molding sand across the floor. Within seconds, the violence had ended. Only smoke remained. The silence afterward felt heavier than the explosion itself. The test casting lay broken among blackened clay. A jagged crack ran from one end to the other. Catherine waited until the metal had darkened enough to approach. She crouched beside the fractured piece. No one interrupted her. She lifted one half. The fracture surface glittered unnaturally in the firelight. Bright, crystalline, almost glass-like. She rubbed the edge with her thumb. It crumbled, not because the explosion had broken it, because the iron itself wanted to break. The sulfur, she said. Owen looked down. So the Duke was right. She slowly shook her head. No. She held up the fractured section. The Duke believed bad iron was useless. Her finger traced the bright crystals. This isn't useless. She looked toward the furnace where the remaining charge still glowed behind the closed tap. It's unfinished. The men stared at her. We've lost nearly half today's fuel, Evan said quietly. I know. We've lost a day. I know. And the mold is ruined. I know. She rose and carried the broken casting to the workbench. For several minutes she said nothing. Then she opened the old pattern-maker's notebook they had recovered the night before. Blank pages remained near the back. She dipped a pen into ink. Instead of writing what had failed, she wrote why. Moisture, sulfur, gas, cooling, one line beneath another. Each mistake became a record instead of a defeat. Owen watched her in silence. Aren't you angry? I was. She closed the notebook. That lasted long enough. She crossed the yard toward the pale limestone ridge above the foundry. The evening light caught the exposed rock, turning it almost silver against the dark hillside. She struck it once with her hammer. A clean fragment broke free. Then another, and another. Behind her, she heard the others approaching without being asked. No speeches were needed. Each man picked up a hammer. Each man began breaking stone. Catherine looked back once toward the damaged test mold, then toward the furnace that still held the remaining iron. We will not pour again tomorrow, she said. The miners stopped. We won't? No. She slipped a piece of limestone into her apron pocket. Tomorrow we change the iron. A cold wind crossed the valley, carrying with it the distant sound of the flooded mine pumps struggling beneath impossible pressure. Somewhere underground, hundreds of men were still waiting. And for the first time since accepting the Duke's contract, Catherine understood that the race was no longer against time alone. It was against the metal itself. 7 days remained. No smoke rose from the main furnace that morning. From the road, Cinder Pit appeared silent enough to convince any passerby that the foundry had surrendered after the failed trial casting. Lord Blackwood's steward, riding past on a state business shortly after sunrise, slowed only long enough to glance toward the chimney before continuing toward the mine with quiet satisfaction. Inside the foundry, however, every hand was occupied. Not with iron, with clay. Catherine stood beside a shallow pit where fresh loam had been mixed through the night. The old molding sand had been broken apart, sifted, and blended with new clay from the riverbank. Wheelbarrows carried the mixture toward a brick chamber. The miners had spent 2 days rebuilding against the eastern wall. It was not another furnace. It was a drying oven. Owen wiped soot from his forehead as he laid the final fire brick into place. I've spent 20 years underground, he said. Never imagined I'd build an oven instead of a mine. You aren't building an oven. What then? The casting. He frowned. The casting isn't even inside yet. It already is. She rested one hand against the warm brickwork. If the mold fails, the iron fails with it. No one argued. After the explosion, Every man in the foundry had learned to fear invisible water more than visible fire. The limestone arrived before noon, not by wagon, by people. An elderly shepherd carried 2 sacks across his shoulders. A widow from the lower cottages pushed a handcart filled with broken white rock gathered from her pasture. 3 boys arrived, dragging a sled loaded with chunks too large for them to lift. None of them asked for payment. News of the failed test had spread through the valley. So, had news that Catherine had refused to abandon the work. She thanked each of them personally. Then, every stone was broken by hand. Hammer after hammer echoed through the yard until the larger pieces became fist-sized fragments, and the fragments became coarse white gravel. Evan watched the growing pile. "You truly believe ordinary stone can change iron?" "It already has." He looked puzzled. "In every furnace that ever deserved to survive." By late afternoon, the furnace breathed again. This charge was different. Catherine measured every basket herself. Cast scrap. Selected wrought iron. More cast scrap. A layer of crushed limestone. Another layer of fuel. Again. 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 Nothing entered the furnace by chance. Owen noticed she rejected nearly half the brittle white castings collected from the yard. "We're throwing away good weight. We're throwing away bad metal. We need every pound. We need every pound that deserves to become part of the cylinder." She closed the charging door. The fire answered with a deeper roar than before. Hours passed. The men expected Catherine to watch the flames as she always had. Instead, she climbed onto the charging platform, carrying a long iron skimmer. When the charge finally settled into a glowing pool, she opened the inspection door only wide enough to reach the surface. Dark material floated across the top of the iron like thick foam. She drew it carefully toward the opening. The skimmer emerged, carrying a heavy black mass streaked with pale gray. Slag. She dropped it into a waiting trough. Steam hissed as it cooled. Again she skimmed. Again. Each pass left the surface below cleaner. Evan crouched beside the trough. "This wasn't here yesterday." "It was. I never saw it. You weren't meant to." He looked at the cooling slag. "So the limestone. I gave the sulfur somewhere else to go." She returned to the furnace before another question could follow. The work demanded attention more than explanation. The new molds remained inside the drying oven for 3 days. No shortcuts. Small fires burned continuously beneath the chamber. Every few hours the molds were turned. Every few hours Catherine checked them by sound instead of touch. A dry mold answered with a sharp knock. A damp one answered softly. On the evening of the 3rd day, she tapped the largest core. The sound rang cleanly through the chamber. Only then did she allow herself a slow breath. "It is ready." The next morning they attempted another test. Not a cylinder, not even a pipe, only a heavy coupling meant to withstand pressure greater than anything used in ordinary mine work. The mold accepted the metal without complaint. No steam escaped. No cracks appeared. The casting cooled through the afternoon, while no one dared approach it. Sunset came, then darkness. Only after the iron had lost its red glow did Catherine strike the mold apart. The coupling emerged black beneath its coating of sand. Whole. She cleaned the surface with a wire brush. No visible fracture. No blister. No cold shut. She nodded toward Owen. "The water pump." The miners carried the piece to the abandoned test stand beside the engine house. An old hand pump forced water into the fitting while pressure slowly climbed. 100 pounds. Nothing. 150. Still dry. 200. The old gasket began to complain before the iron did. Water leaked around the worn leather packing, but nowhere through the casting itself. The village engineer, Samuel Griffith, knelt beside the fitting with a lantern. He ran his fingers across every surface before standing again. "I've seen cylinders split at half this pressure." He looked at Catherine. "This one hasn't even begun." Word spread before dawn. By breakfast, someone left 2 sacks of charcoal outside the foundry gate. Before noon, another family delivered seasoned timber. By evening, a blacksmith arrived carrying a bundle of forged tools wrapped in canvas. "I can't spare coin," he said, "but I can spare these." No speeches followed. No celebration. Only work. Inside the office, Samuel Griffith unfolded his notebook. I'll need a sample. For what? I know a royal engineer traveling through Cardiff. He turned the coupling slowly beneath the lamp. He's been asking impossible questions about stronger cast iron. Catherine looked once toward the foundry yard, where the repaired furnace glowed steadily against the autumn night. The first battle had been won. The harder one, the 5-ton cylinder waiting in the loft, had not yet begun. 5 days remained. The foundry no longer woke alone. Before sunrise, footsteps already crossed the yard. Farmers arrived carrying split timber too crooked for carpentry, but perfect for furnace firing. A cooper rolled in cracked barrels that could be cut apart for charcoal. The village blacksmith returned with a sack of worn punches and broken tongs. None of it looked valuable. To Catherine, every delivery meant another hour. The furnace could remain alive. She thanked each person with the same promise. When the miners come home, this foundry will remember who kept it burning. No one asked for a written receipt. The words were enough. Samuel Griffith returned shortly after daylight. He carried the pressure coupling beneath one arm, wrapped in coarse linen to keep it from rusting in the damp morning air. I've tested it 3 more times. And it still hasn't failed. He laid the casting on the workbench. The leather seals gave out before the iron showed the slightest weakness. Owen grinned. The Duke's cylinders never managed that. Samuel did not smile. Which is why you must assume he'll hear about this before nightfall. The room grew quiet. Catherine looked toward the furnace. Then we have less time than we thought. The giant wooden cylinder pattern dominated the molding loft. For 2 days it had remained untouched, while the furnace and alloy demanded attention. Now it became the center of the foundry. Dust was brushed away. Measurements were checked twice. Every joint was inspected. The pattern maker who had built it decades earlier had carved tiny witness marks along its length, so each section would return to exactly the same position. Catherine followed each mark with her fingertips. He expected this pattern to be used again. Samuel climbed the loft stairs behind her. It never was. He built it as though someone eventually would. She nodded toward the joints. That sort of faith deserves accuracy. The molding floor became a place of careful rhythm rather than hurried labor. Fresh loam was packed around the great pattern 1 layer at a time. No shovel struck carelessly. No section was allowed to dry unevenly. Each layer had to support the next. Evan complained only once. At this pace we'll finish after the mine floods. Catherine handed him a wooden rammer. Strike that corner. He obeyed. The surface seemed solid. She struck beside it. The clay settled nearly half an inch. It looked finished, Evan admitted. It looked finished. She repeated the words. It wasn't. After that, no one asked to hurry the work again. Late that afternoon, a carriage stopped outside the foundry gate. It carried neither coal nor timber. Only a single rider dressed in a dark riding coat trimmed with estate colors. Lord Blackwood's steward climbed down without removing his gloves. I've brought a notice. Owen reached for it. The steward stepped back. It is addressed to the operator. Catherine came forward. The paper bore the Duke's seal. She broke it open. The message was brief. All deliveries of high-grade coke to Cinder Pit Foundry are suspended pending an estate safety review. Unauthorized removal of estate fuel will be prosecuted. Nothing more. No accusation. No explanation. Only a signature. Samuel folded his arms. He cannot stop us from using charcoal. No. Catherine looked toward the nearly empty coke bins. But he knows charcoal cannot hold full pouring temperature for long. The steward mounted his horse again. The Duke wishes you every success. Then he rode away. Owen spat into the mud after him. That evening Catherine unlocked a forgotten storage room beneath the pattern loft. The door had swollen shut years earlier. Inside stood shelves coated in soot. Broken ladles. Bent tongs. Fragments of refractory brick. Nothing remarkable. Until she noticed the ledgers. 3 volumes rested beneath a layer of ash thick enough to hide their bindings. She carried them into the office. Most pages recorded ordinary work. Dates. Fuel. Repairs. Orders. Then one entry caught her eye. It described a large pumping cylinder cast nearly 20 years before. The margin contained a short note written by the former master founder. Reduced sulfur by increasing lime charge. Improved strength after slow cooling. Repeat. No explanation. No formula. Just an observation made by someone who had trusted experience more than theory. Catherine closed the book. She smiled quietly. We're not inventing this. Samuel looked over her shoulder. No, we're remembering it. The molds continued drying through the night. The furnace burned lower to save fuel. Outside, rain began again. Soft at first, then steady. Water drummed across the broken roof until every person inside the foundry worked beneath a constant whisper of autumn weather. Owen looked toward the ceiling. If the rain keeps coming, the mine fills faster. He nodded. No one needed to finish the sentence. Just before midnight, a young messenger arrived on horseback. His boots were soaked through. I came from Cardiff. Samuel took the folded note first. His expression changed before he spoke. What is it? Catherine asked. The Royal Engineer. He handed her the paper. The letter was short. The sample had arrived. The iron had attracted immediate attention. Whoever produced it was instructed not to sell the process privately until an inspection could be arranged. There was no signature she recognized, only an official seal. Samuel let out a slow breath. They know your name now. Catherine folded the letter and placed it inside the ledger. Then we cannot fail. She stepped back onto the molding floor. The giant cylinder mold stood complete at last, rising from the packed earth like the foundation of a tower yet to be built. She rested one soot-darkened hand against its side. For the first time, the casting no longer seemed impossible. It seemed inevitable. If the Duke did not find another way to stop it, 3 days remained. The valley woke to the sound of wagons. Not coal wagons, not supply wagons. Estate wagons. They arrived just after sunrise beneath the escort of mounted bailiffs wearing Lord Blackwood's colors. Their horses stopped outside the foundry gate while laborers climbed down carrying crowbars, chains, and official notices sealed with red wax. No one unloaded a single sack of fuel. They had come for something else. Owen was the first to understand. They're not bringing supplies. He tightened his grip around a shovel. They're taking them. The chief bailiff unfolded a document before anyone spoke. By authority of the Blackwood estate. His voice echoed across the yard. By all movable machinery listed as collateral against outstanding industrial debt is hereby seized until further notice. The words sounded legal. Their purpose was simpler. 2 men walked directly toward the foundry crane. Another group headed for the gear house. A third began marking the iron rollers that supported the great pouring ladle. Samuel Griffith stepped into their path. You cannot remove those. I don't need your permission. The casting is for the rescue engine. The document says nothing about rescue. It mentioned debt. Nothing else. Catherine did not argue. She stood beside the furnace, watching the men work with the same attention she usually gave molten iron. Bolts were removed. Iron pins drifted into wooden crates. The geared winch disappeared piece by piece. The great lifting wheels were rolled toward waiting wagons. Every sound seemed strangely careful. Blackwood wanted no violence. Only delay. Delay was enough. When the final chain came free from the crane, the old timber arm sagged several inches under its own weight. The bailiff dusted his gloves. The foundry remains yours, Mrs. Vance. He folded the notice. The machinery does not. Then the wagons departed. No one spoke until the last wheel vanished beyond the bend in the road. Inside the foundry, silence felt larger than the building itself. The giant mold stood ready. The alloy was ready. The furnace could be brought to pouring heat. Yet the enormous ladle could no longer be lifted from the tapping floor. 5 tons of iron might as well have been 5 mountains. Evan broke the silence first. We're finished. No one answered him. Samuel walked beneath the crippled crane, measuring empty space with his eyes. We could build another. In 3 days? Owen asked. Samuel looked away. No. Another miner suggested smaller castings joined together afterward. Catherine shook her head immediately. The cylinder must be one body, then a stronger beam. We don't have timber. A larger team of horses. They cannot stand inside the foundry. Each idea failed before it reached its end. The room slowly filled with the weight of impossible arithmetic. That evening, Catherine climbed alone into the pattern loft. Rain tapped softly against the damaged roof. Below her, the giant mold waited beneath its canvas, covering. She unrolled the original drawings one final time, not searching for dimensions, searching for assumptions. Every drawing assumed one thing: a crane. Every founder before her had expected the iron to travel upward before it descended into the mold. She stared at the page until the candle beside her burned halfway down. Then she folded the drawing closed. "The drawing isn't wrong," she whispered. "It simply belongs to a different foundry." She climbed down, carrying only a lantern. Instead of stopping beside the mold, she walked past it, past the crane, past the furnace. She continued until she reached the packed earth beneath the casting floor itself. There she drove the steel bar into the ground. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound changed. Not stone, not solid clay, compact fill. She struck again. Owen appeared behind her. "What are you doing?" "Listening." "To what?" "The ground." He frowned. She drove the bar deeper. This time it sank nearly a foot before stopping. Her eyes narrowed. "Bring me a shovel." Within minutes, every miner had gathered around her. No one yet understood. They dug because she had asked. The first layer came away easily, then harder clay, then gravel. The hole deepened until Evan finally climbed out, wiping mud from his hands. "We're beneath the casting floor." "Good. But why?" Catherine took the lantern from Owen. She held it over the excavation. The flame illuminated the difference in height between the pit and the furnace tapping arch. Only a few feet. Enough. She looked from the glowing furnace mouth to the deepening hole. Her breathing slowed. Samuel noticed before anyone else. "You've thought of something." She nodded. "Not completely." "What?" She pointed first toward the furnace, then toward the excavation. "If the iron refuses to climb," the others waited. "Perhaps the mold should." No one spoke. The idea seemed absurd. Move the mold instead of the metal. Samuel walked slowly around the pit. His engineer's mind followed the line Catherine had already seen. If the mold sat below the tap hole, the iron would flow downhill. No crane, no lifting, no suspended ladle, only gravity. The oldest machine in the world. Owen looked from one face to another. "Can it be done?" Catherine stared into the darkness below. "It has never been done here." Samuel smiled for the first time in days. "That isn't the same answer." She returned the smile, though only faintly. "No, it isn't." Long after midnight, the foundry filled with the sound of shovels. Not because anyone had ordered them to continue, because every person now understood there was still one path left. Narrow, dangerous, entirely untested, but real. Outside, unseen beyond the hills, floodwater continued rising through the galleries beneath Brynglass Mine. Inside Cinder Pit, every shovel of earth carried the mold one step closer to the only force powerful enough to replace the stolen crane: gravity itself. 30 minutes remained before the melt would be lost. The furnace had reached pouring heat. It could not wait. Inside the reverberatory chamber, 5 tons of iron glowed beneath the sweeping flame, its surface moving with slow, heavy currents that reflected white along the hottest edges. Every minute, the charge remained inside the hearth, consumed fuel they no longer possessed. Every minute increased the risk that the metal would cool unevenly and freeze against the furnace floor. If that happened, Cinder Pit itself would become a tomb. No furnace could be broken apart quickly enough to recover it. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, every sound belonged to labor. Steel struck earth. Shovels scraped stone. Breathing echoed beneath the broken roof. No one counted the hours anymore. Only the distance between the tap hole and the bottom of the pit. Samuel climbed out of the excavation, soaked with clay from the waist down. "We're nearly there." "How much?" He held the measuring rod against the furnace sill. 18 inches. Catherine shook her head. "Not enough. The iron will still run. It must never hesitate." He understood. Molten metal behaved like water only until it chose not to. A shallow grade could rob it of speed. A moment's hesitation inside a runner could chill the surface. One obstruction, one frozen pocket, one blockage. The casting would fail before the mold filled. Samuel lifted the rod again. Another foot. Owen stared into the pit. We'll never finish. We don't need forever, Catherine answered. We need one path. The mold had already been lowered into its new position. Timbers supported its weight while wedges kept it perfectly true. Every measurement was checked twice, then checked again. The great cylinder now rested below the level of the furnace for the first time in the history of the foundry. Evan ran his hand along the packed sand runners. They're crooked. They're meant to be. They don't follow a straight line. They follow the ground. She knelt beside the first gate and pressed fresh-facing sand against its walls. The iron doesn't care about beautiful drawings. She looked toward the furnace. It only cares whether we understand where it wants to go. Before anyone could return to work, another sound rolled into the yard. Hoofbeats. Not many. Enough. Lord Blackwood rode through the open gate without haste. Only 4 mounted estate men followed him. He did not come armed for battle. He came dressed for inspection. His horse stopped beside the silent crane. He studied the excavation, the lowered mold, the workers covered in clay. For several moments he said nothing. Then he smiled. So, his gaze settled on Catherine. You have decided to bury your foundry. No. She wiped damp earth from her hands. I've decided to use it. He dismounted slowly. I've seen foundries across 3 counties. So have I. I've never seen anyone place a mold beneath the floor. Then today will be educational. A faint laugh escaped him. Or memorable. He walked toward the furnace until the heat forced him to stop. The charge must already be cooling. It is. And yet your crane is gone. It is. You cannot lift the ladle. We won't. Blackwood followed her eyes toward the pit. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. Only for an instant. Then, it disappeared. You truly believe Earth can replace machinery? I believe gravity has worked longer than either of us. He turned toward Samuel. You are an engineer. I am. Tell her this is madness. Samuel looked once at the furnace. Then, at the runners disappearing into the earth. I would have called it madness yesterday. And today, I call it the only remaining solution. Blackwood's expression hardened. Then you will share responsibility for what follows. Samuel answered without raising his voice. I already do. The Duke mounted his horse again. He did not leave immediately. He chose instead to remain beyond the furnace yard, where he could watch without standing among the workers. He expected failure. Catherine knew it. That no longer mattered. She looked at Owen. Close the upper vents. Evan. Seal every joint in the runners. Samuel. The mold alignment. Already checked. Check it again. No one complained. Every instruction had become another stone in a bridge that could exist only once. The final measurement was taken. Samuel laid the rule across the furnace threshold and extended it toward the highest point of the runner. Then he smiled. It falls. Enough. Enough. Catherine closed her eyes for only a heartbeat. Not in relief. In calculation. She pictured the entire journey. From the furnace, across the sand channels, down the slope, around the bend, into the gates, around the core, up through the risers. No cranes, no suspended weight, only flowing metal. When she opened her eyes again, the decision had already been made. She picked up the long steel tapping bar. Every worker stepped clear. The foundry became utterly silent. Even Lord Blackwood's horse stood motionless beyond the yard. Catherine planted the point of the bar against the clay plug sealing the tap hole. The iron behind it pressed with unimaginable weight. She wrapped both hands around the shaft, looked once toward the buried mold, then struck. The first blow cracked the clay. The second drove the point deeper. A dull roar answered from inside the furnace. The third blow broke the seal. A brilliant tongue of white metal burst through the opening, hesitated for the briefest fraction of a second at the lip of the channel, and then surrendered to gravity. The river of fire began to run. The stream of molten iron never rushed. It moved with terrible patience. Once gravity claimed it, the glowing metal followed the sand channels exactly as Catherine had drawn them across the foundry floor. It curved around each bend without breaking apart, carrying a skin of orange light over a heart so bright it bordered on white. No one spoke. The smallest mistake now would not announce itself with noise. It would simply stop flowing. Samuel knelt beside the first runner, lantern in one hand and a long iron rod in the other. He watched the leading edge advance through the channel until it disappeared beneath the packed earth surrounding the buried mold. "It reached the gate," he called. Catherine did not answer. She was already watching the first riser. For several endless seconds nothing happened. Then a dull glow appeared inside the narrow opening. The iron had reached the bottom of the mold. It was climbing. "Second riser," Owen shouted. Another orange light emerged. Then another. Each riser filled in turn until all of them carried the same steady glow. Only then did Catherine allow the tap hole to remain fully open. "There," she said quietly. "It has the mold." The furnace continued feeding the casting until the final measure of iron disappeared into the channels. Samuel drove a clay plug into the tap hole with 3 heavy blows. The roar inside the furnace faded. The foundry became strangely quiet. No one could see the cylinder. 5 tons of iron now rested beneath the earth, hidden inside clay and sand, where it would either become the strongest casting the valley had ever seen or crack itself apart before sunrise. Lord Blackwood remained beside his horse. "You've buried your evidence," he said. "No," Catherine replied. "I've buried the work." He looked toward the mound where faint heat shimmered into the cold evening air. "You expect me to believe success lies under dirt? I expect nothing from you." She turned away before he could answer. It was the first time since signing his contract that she had denied him the satisfaction of holding her attention. The night became another kind of labor. No one slept. The mold had to cool slowly. Too much cold air would shrink the outer walls before the center settled. Too much heat would trap stress inside the iron. Catherine ordered every opening in the foundry closed except the high roof vents. Small charcoal fires burned around the casting pit, not to heat the mold, but to keep the surrounding air from cooling too quickly. Samuel looked at the arrangement with quiet admiration. "You're protecting the cooling. I'm protecting the crystal." He nodded. "The metal remembers how it is treated. So do people." Before dawn, hoofbeats echoed once more across the valley. This time they belonged to engineers from the mine. Behind them came exhausted workers carrying stretchers, ropes, and lengths of pipe already prepared for the rescue engine. The mine captain dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. "Water reached the upper galleries before midnight." "How long?" The captain hesitated. "If the pump isn't running today." He never finished the sentence. He did not need to. Every face in the yard already knew what waited underground. The mold was opened beneath a pale autumn sky. No one struck it carelessly. Each wedge came free, one at a time. Each section of loam was lifted clear before another was touched. The first curve of iron appeared beneath its coating of dark sand. Smooth. No visible tear. No cold shut. Samuel brushed away more sand with trembling hands. The cylinder emerged inch by inch from the earth that had protected it through the night. The casting was enormous. Its surface carried the faint texture of the loam mold, but no visible fracture crossed its length. Owen ran both hands along the side. "It sounds wrong." Samuel frowned. "What?" "When I strike it." He tapped lightly with a small hammer. Instead of the short, brittle ring everyone expected, the casting answered with a deep, solid note that lingered through the foundry. Catherine smiled. "It isn't wrong. It's different." The pressure test took place beside the mine engine before half the county. Miners stood shoulder to shoulder with farmers. Blacksmiths crowded beside merchants. Even those who had laughed when Catherine accepted Blackwood's contract now waited in complete silence. Steam entered the cylinder slowly. Pressure climbed. The gauge rose past the level that had destroyed the previous casting. Still the cylinder held. Higher. The bolts groaned. Moisture hissed around the old leather seals. The iron remained perfectly dry. Samuel raised one hand. More. The engine operator obeyed. The needle climbed again until no one present had ever seen it reach so high. Nothing failed. Samuel stepped forward and laid his bare palm against the cylinder. Cold. Steady. Whole. He turned toward the assembled crowd. "It holds." No speech followed. None was necessary. The engine crew opened the final valve. Steam drove the great piston forward. The beam above the engine house shuddered once, then settled into a steady rhythm. Far below the earth, the pump rods answered. Water that had ruled the mine for days finally began to retreat. A low sound rolled through the valley. Not cheering. Relief. Men who had feared they would never again see daylight had been given another chance. Lord Blackwood watched the engine complete its first full stroke. He said nothing. For the first time since Catherine had entered Cinder Pit, silence belonged to him instead of to her. Samuel unfolded another document before the gathered witnesses. It was not a contract. It was the laboratory report commissioned after the first failed rescue cylinder months earlier. The sulfur content exceeded every accepted specification, he said. Several engineers exchanged uneasy glances. Samuel continued. The records show the material was approved despite repeated warnings. The mine captain slowly turned toward Blackwood. So the failure wasn't an accident. No, Samuel answered. It was a decision. The valley grew quiet once more. This time, not because people were waiting for iron. They were waiting for justice. Winter arrived quietly. The first frost settled across the roofs of Cinder Pit before dawn, whitening the repaired chimney and the timber yard with a thin layer of ice. Smoke climbed from the foundry in a steady column, darker than the pale morning sky, carrying with it the familiar scent of coke, charcoal, damp stone, and hot iron. This time, the smoke did not announce disaster. It announced work. The great pumping cylinder had been operating for nearly 3 weeks. Water levels inside Bryn Glass Mine had fallen enough for rescue teams to reopen galleries that had been abandoned since the flood. One by one, exhausted miners emerged into daylight. Some walked without assistance. Others leaned heavily on friends who refused to let them fall. When the last surviving crew reached the surface, no speeches were made. The men simply removed their caps as they passed the road leading toward Cinder Pit. That gesture traveled farther than applause ever could. Inside the foundry, new orders covered the office wall. Replacement pump parts, boiler fittings, mine valves, bridge bearings. Each contract was smaller than the rescue cylinder. Together they promised something far more valuable. A future. Samuel Griffith rolled another drawing across Catherine's work table. The Royal Commission has approved the inspection. She looked up from the day's furnace ledger. When? They're already on the road. She closed the ledger without haste. Then they should see us working. Not preparing. Not pretending. Working. The inspection party arrived before noon. 3 engineers, 2 clerks, and a representative from the Crown entered the foundry, while molten iron was already flowing through a smaller mold. No one interrupted the pour. The visitors waited. Only after the casting had been completed did the senior engineer remove his gloves. I expected a demonstration. Catherine wiped soot from her hands with a linen cloth. You've just seen one. He glanced toward the still smoking mold. Without ceremony, I don't know another way to make iron. A faint smile appeared beneath his gray beard. Neither do I. The inspection lasted hours. They examined furnace records, fuel accounts, pattern drawings, repair notes, cooling schedules. Every page Catherine had insisted Owen record from the first day onward now became evidence not merely that the foundry had succeeded once, but that its success could be repeated. One of the younger engineers paused over the earliest entries. You recorded the color of the flame, every heat. Most founders don't. Most founders also forget why a good pour was good. The engineer carefully closed the ledger. I don't believe you'll forget. The report was signed before sunset. It granted Cinder Pit approval to manufacture heavy steam castings under royal inspection. For a long moment, no one inside the office spoke. Owen finally broke the silence. So, he looked toward the furnace. We're truly alive again. Catherine folded the document. No, she smiled. We've begun. News traveled faster than wagons. Within a week, merchants who had ignored Cinder Pit for years arrived asking about delivery schedules. Blacksmiths sought apprenticeships for their sons. Young pattern makers came hoping to learn the methods used inside the rebuilt foundry. Catherine accepted only a few. Skill mattered. Character mattered more. Every apprentice spent the first week sweeping floors, repairing molds, and recording furnace temperatures before touching molten metal. Samuel laughed the first time he watched one of them complain. You frightened them. I've taught them. There's a difference? There must be. She looked toward the casting floor where glowing iron disappeared into another mold. Otherwise, they become dangerous. The inquiry into Brynglas mine lasted through the winter. Engineers examined fractured cylinders recovered from the flooded engine house. Chemists compared samples from Blackwood's purchases with the records preserved in the mine office. The figures refused to lie. Cheaper iron, higher sulfur, lower strength, repeated warnings ignored. When the commission completed its findings, responsibility no longer rested on rumor or accusation. It rested on signed invoices and laboratory reports. Lord Henry Blackwood was stripped of operational control over the mine pending criminal proceedings. Several estate officials resigned before they could be dismissed. Others attempted to claim ignorance. The documents gave them little protection. Months later, Catherine crossed the Foundry yard, carrying the same steel tapping bar she had held on the day the river of fire first ran beneath the furnace. Children now played beyond the outer wall, while wagons waited their turn beside the loading platform. The broken crane had not been rebuilt. Instead, a new casting pit occupied the center of the foundry, designed from the beginning to use gravity wherever possible. Visitors often asked why the old crane remained standing, though permanently retired. She never ordered it removed. It reminded everyone that necessity had changed the foundry more completely than comfort ever could. Near the office entrance hung two objects side by side. The first was the transfer contract Lord Blackwood had signed to destroy her. Its paper had yellowed around the edges, but the ink remained clear. The second was Thomas Vance's helmet. The blood had long since been cleaned away. The deep dent remained. No one had repaired it. Exactly as Catherine had instructed. Every apprentice entering the foundry asked about the helmet. Every apprentice received the same answer. That is why we measure twice. Not because mistakes were embarrassing, because someone always paid for them. Late one afternoon, Samuel found Catherine standing beside the furnace after the workers had gone home. The fire burned low. Snow drifted beyond the open doorway. "You could own this place outright now," he said. She shook her head. "I never wanted to." He looked puzzled. The contracts alone belonged to the foundry. She unfolded a new charter resting on the workbench. Ownership had been divided among the men and women whose labor kept Cinderpit alive. Engineers, founders, pattern makers, laborers, widows of miners who had not survived the flood. Each held a share. Each held a vote. Samuel read the final page before looking back at her. "You've given away a fortune. I've prevented another duke from owning one." For a long moment, neither spoke. The furnace breathed softly behind them. Outside, the steady rhythm of the great mine pump echoed across the valley. Not loud, not dramatic, simply constant. The same sound that had once meant hope now meant ordinary work. It was the finest victory Catherine could have imagined. She stepped toward the office door and glanced once more at the helmet and the contract hanging together beneath the warm glow of the wall lamp. One had marked the price of corruption. The other had marked the attempt to bury it. Neither had been allowed to write the ending. Beyond the windows, Cinderpit Foundry continued through the winter night, its fires reflected against the snow, forging iron that would outlast the people who made it, and reminding every traveler who saw its chimney that the strongest foundations were sometimes built from what others had thrown away.